So, as always, a big tribal hello and welcome to the last in our series of webinars. We have a great session lined up today, and I'm really pleased to welcome back Karl Sakas from Sakas and Company in the US, who some of you will remember spoke to us earlier this year. I think it's a really appropriate way to finish the webinar series. It's all about the importance of leadership as we go forward. It's about succeeding. Karl's going to talk to us about having a sustainably successful agency and the importance these agencies attach to having strong owners who are committed to continuously improving. So that's the topic for the next hour or so. As always, we're recording this session, and we will share that recording with everybody. It's the last one, so feel free to send in your questions and we'll pick up with them, and we'll ask Karl the questions at the end. But back to the main event. Karl, it's great to have you with us, and I know you've got a really interesting first chart to get everybody thinking. Karl, over to you.
For sure. Ian, great to be back, and thank you everyone for taking time, either an hour now or if you're listening to the recording. Appreciate your dedication to improving your agency in a difficult time. You know, on one hand, things seem like they take forever these days. It could be exhausting, but also things can happen very quickly, very rapidly. And in fact, if you're on chat, if you're listening live, I need to hear from you. Here's a quote, and my question is this quote from this year or from before this year? Would love to hear your guesses. The quote is this: "It is unfortunately one of the chief characteristics of modern business to always be in a hurry. In olden times, it was different." Go ahead and share in chat. Is this from this year or from before this year? What do you think?
Karl, could I just ask to get the presentation up across? It's just very small. I don't know if everyone else sees it very small, but it's very small at the moment, so we can get it up.
I think if you switch it potentially to pin me as the speaker and set it to speaker view.
Yeah, Elaine will just get that organized for us.
Yes, it'll make it easier to read everything. It said, Daniel, you said you can see it full screen. You know what? If people can't see me full screen right now, Kat mentioned that. If you switch the view from gallery view or panel view over to speaker view, that might take care of it.
Yeah.
Javier, thank you. Vanya.
Good. We're okay. We're okay. I apologize for the interruption. I just want to make sure.
Oh, not a problem. Well, giving people a chance. So I see James, you mentioned before times. Any other votes? I see some coming in. Well, I have to say, either one would be a good choice, right? This certainly feels like a kind of a quote from today. But it is, if you had guessed, if it's before this year, that would be the most accurate answer. That particular quote is from 1884, right? Harkening back to olden times when business wasn't moving quite so quickly. We've been thinking about that for a long time. So that's looking past. What about looking ahead to the future? Well, we can look at it from two perspectives. We can look at it in terms of the industry's future, and we can also look in terms of your agency's specific future. Everyone wants to know what's in it for me. Well, we'll take a look at that for you. So let's predict the future. And as we look into the future, what challenges and opportunities loom for you and your agency? On chat, I'm curious if you want to share, what are some of the industry level challenges you're observing right now? Go ahead and share those on chat. I've made a list of potential possibilities. Let's consider, because as we wrap up this year and head into a new year, the more we can do to predict the future, the better we can prepare. And then we'll take a look at the future specific to your agency. There are changes in the workplace, of course, from a COVID and a real estate perspective, people working remotely or increasingly remotely, or not. Different people are in different situations. How do you maintain team culture as people are increasingly working outside your traditional office, however that might be structured? And of course, remote client challenges as you provide your services to clients. Think in the past where a client was like, we need you here to meet with us and meet with the team. There's less pressure for that now. You're not on a plane or on a train or driving as much. That creates some new opportunities with your time. On the other hand, when you're communicating with clients, there are a lot of distractions. You're not face to face with them in a conference room the way you might have been before. Like, you can hear their distractions and notice their distractions. So that's a challenge. Some clients want you to just do things for them. Others want, a bit more support and guidance strategically. Your sales and marketing shift, of course, selling when you can't meet as easily face to face, marketing when there's a ton of competition, right? Everyone's putting out content and beyond. And there's also fatigue on a both B2B and B2C perspective about, Zoom, and such as it is. And of course, there are changes in consumption for both consumers and B2B. Of course, your agency is working with B2B clients, like the clients themselves. It's a business-to-business relationship, even if you're doing business-to-consumer work for your clients. People have back-to-back calls. Certain industries have cratered, others are doing very well. People are distracted. Professional development is virtual. There is, of course, thinking right at the moment, geopolitical instability. Here in the US, I would have thought the election would have been, a fully resolved question by now, but sadly not. Hopefully that'll settle out soon. Of course, with the question around the vaccine or vaccines coming out, what will shift there? Business and life uncertainty. More uncertainty now, I think, about just life in general than, say, the Cold War. And here we are now, people wondering what's going to happen. And in my work as an agency consultant, there was one week where 3 different clients were having existential crises about what do they want, what's right for them. Something's in the air. So I'm curious, I'm seeing some sharing in chat. What would you add to the list about industry level challenges? We've also seen some things about clients taking work in-house. On the other hand, some of the clients who took work in-house then laid people off, and then they're outsourcing to agencies again, because it's easier to do that kind of outsourcing decision than to rehire someone. I see a comment about increase in competition. For sure. If someone was thinking of starting their own agency and decided now is their time, they will. One of my own team members actually earlier this summer decided she was going to start her own agency, and she did. So there are always going to be new competitors to your agency. Things are changing. Let's take a look at some specifics related to your future, right? Because this is the general industry list. Let's look at you specifically, because the more you can prepare, the better decisions you can make now for the future. So consider preparing for your future. I've identified in my work across working with nearly 400 agencies all over the world, 36 countries, there are certain patterns, and there's a certain thing you can focus on, and that's ultimately this. If you want your agency to thrive in the future, with you well compensated and minimally stressed, you need to adopt a proactive yet flexible approach to leadership, proactive yet flexible approach that balances warmth and competence. What are warmth and competence? Well, we'll talk about that in a moment. But that idea of being proactive yet flexible gives you space to handle whatever inevitably will come up. And in fact, we're going to talk about three concepts today to help you in your future preparation, regardless of what ultimately happens for you and your firm. And if you have questions along the way, go ahead and share those in chat, ideally out to everyone so everyone can see them, or you could also submit them to Elaine and Ian, and they'll share them with me toward the end. So what are the three concepts? First, when you prepare for the expected, you have space to improvise the unexpected. There are a lot of things that we can expect. There's some things we can't expect, and I'm going to share some tips to help you deal with both situations. That's the first concept. Second concept is that idea of warmth and competence. I touched on that earlier. We'll dig into what it is and how you can apply it at your agency to help you make life easier for you and your team and your clients. It's a win-win-win kind of situation, warmth and competence. And the third concept is about making yourself increasingly optional in your agency, increasingly optional on a day-to-day basis. And I have a 4-step day-to-day involvement meter that'll help you understand where are you today and where do you want to go? And once you know that, point A and point B, there are specific things you can do to improve your situation. So those are our three key points for today. Prepare for the expected so you can improvise the unexpected. Warmth and competence to improve as a leader and in your work with your clients. And then changing how you approach the day-to-day of running your agency. So let's take a closer look at each of those. And of course, glad to answer your questions at the end based on what you share. Concept number one. When you prepare for the expected, you have space, you have time, you have room to improvise the unexpected. A few years ago, I was experiencing abdominal pain, lower abdominal pain on the right side. And, whenever you have medical issues, you do what anyone does. I did what anyone would do. I started Googling my symptoms. And, when you start Googling medical symptoms, that's not pretty. You hear about all of the terrible possibilities, right? And the pain, was going for several days. And I finally decided that, Dr. Google wasn't going to solve things. I went to my actual doctor. And, he was like, well, it could be abdominal, the abdominal pain. It could be a bit appendicitis, but you would have been in the ER within a day, if that were the case. So it's probably something else. Well, it turned out he misdiagnosed it. After a week of pain, it turned out that, yes, I did have appendicitis. More specifically, I had a ruptured appendix. And I was not ready for this, as I discovered at the emergency room. Well, how did that go? They decided not to do surgery immediately. The surgeon was like, apparently he considered a number of factors. He said, the new research coming out of Europe is that you don't operate immediately if it's ruptured. You do antibiotics and then decide what to do. That was one of the factors. I think the other factor was that I showed up on a holiday weekend and he didn't want to call the surgical team in on the holiday weekend. So I scheduled surgery for a couple months later. And that was the plan, except it didn't go as expected, which is the appendicitis came back before the scheduled surgery. So on one hand, this was terrible. On the other hand, I was prepared. I knew what to expect. I knew, for instance, I go to the in-network hospital, not the out-of-network hospital, where everything would be more expensive. Thanks, U.S. healthcare. I knew, for instance, to bring a cell phone charger. That was a problem the first time, right? You got your phone, but no charger. What do you do? I had a list. I was able to reach out to my assistant to start canceling things, reach out to my family to let them know, what had happened, and that kind of thing. So, if you get appendicitis twice, you will be prepared because you know what to expect the second time, though I hope they take it out the first time and you don't have quite my situation there. If you've had appendicitis, by the way, feel free to share in chat. You can, share your proud membership in the club or something like that. So, what is the biggest surprise you've encountered in your agency? Thinking about your work as an agency owner, agency leader, what is the biggest surprise you've experienced in running your agency? And it might be appendicitis. I hope not. It might be something else. I've made a list of expected problems you might have in your agency, and if people want to keep things anonymous, certainly, Ian and Elaine, I imagine you've seen a lot of challenges in your work. If there are any anonymous examples you want to share, please go for it. What are the biggest surprises you've encountered at your agency? While people share, I'm going to go ahead and share a list of some expected problems that I see across all of the agencies I work with. Expected problem: a key employee quits. You've got a critical employee and they resign, they leave. Maybe you lose a client. You will someday lose a client. Maybe it's that you've lost a big client. If you've got a big client, they're going to leave someday, whether voluntarily or not. There's really just a question of when, not if. You might have a new competitor. Ian, you were sharing earlier about new competition and increase in competition. I mean, maybe that new competitor is one of your former employees who leaves and, sets up shop and they're competing against you. All the more reason, by the way, to have a non-solicitation agreement with your team so that people can't just steal all of the clients and steal all of your team members when they leave. Talk to your lawyer, but definitely important to have non-solicitation agreements. Maybe you've got an employee or a business partner, whether an equity partner or an external business partner, another firm, who lets you down. You were relying on them and they let you down. Not a good situation, but it will happen inevitably. The expected aspect is about, there's a question of when, not if. Maybe you've got a new employee. You're relying on a new employee to help you make things better, help, make the agency, help you grow, help you fix some problems at your agency. And you might find that, they don't work out. In an extreme example, I worked with an agency who mentioned the owner reached out and said, I've got a salesperson. He is not hitting his quota. And I said, how long has he not been hitting his quota? Answer, she hired him a year and a half earlier. Her answer, the whole time, he had never hit his quota. He was supposed to help her double the agency size, and instead revenues were up maybe 10%, what they would have been organically, and she had paid him 6 figures to do nothing, or at least do nothing from a results perspective. That can be an expected thing, and there's some things you can do to help prevent that, including a new hire ramp-up plan. If you have some questions on that, glad to answer those. Maybe you run into a cash crunch. A year and a half ago, I was writing about preparing for the next recession, and one of the things I mentioned was building your cash reserves. Never regret building your cash reserves beyond where they are now. You can also run into a cash crunch if you've got, say, a big client and they decide to pause payments, or maybe several clients decide to pause payments. You can have a cash crunch. Maybe you've got a national or global crisis. Before the pandemic hit, might have said, well, are we going to have a pandemic this year? Few people guessed that it was going to happen exactly as it did. I previously dated a public health epidemiologist, And from that experience, from some of the things she shared, I got the impression that, infectious diseases were less under control than I might have expected. So, when the news came out, I guess I wasn't surprised about the spread, but I certainly didn't expect the economic downturn that we experienced. There's going to be some sort of a crisis. How prepared are you? And thinking, what would you add to the list? What is expected? As you think about dealing with expected challenges, we will talk about how to improvise when you run into unexpected challenges. Let's take a look at what to do. And Ian and Elaine, is there anything you'd add to the list in terms of things that seem inevitable eventually?
I think at the moment you've got most of them, and I think the national or global crisis is what is consuming everybody at the moment in terms of how they work their way through it, how they
Yes.
survive. That is the kind of number one, I think, for most people, because everything else you've got there is a kind of knock-on effect of
Yeah.
that.
Exactly. Well, look, here's what you can do when you've got, when it comes to preparing for the expected from a crisis perspective. First, make a list of the top scenarios. I shared a list of different possibilities. What is most likely to impact you and your agency, from the list above. You also want to customize the list to your particular situation. For instance, if you have a client concentration problem, maybe you've got, this is if you have a client that is, I define it, more than 20% of your business, you've got a client concentration problem. If that client either leaves or is thinking of leaving, it's going to be a major negative impact on your agency. On the other hand, if you are well diversified, you don't have a client concentration problem, that might not be a key concern on your list. Although you might have a client dilution problem, which is its own situation. But ultimately, the goal is to make that list about what to expect. You also want to consider that there may be some things that are a very small chance, but if they do happen, the impact is very large. So it's not just what's most likely to happen, but what is the impact on your agency? And then work with your team to map out solutions. Obviously, if your cash reserves are low, now is too late to deal with that. You're going to have to take some other steps. But this gives you a general framework for the things that haven't happened yet, right? We talked, if you joined my session with Tribe earlier this year, about how people are responding to COVID. Now, of course, we're further along in the year there. But, think about the other things on that list, right? What here hasn't happened? It's going to happen at some point. Key employee leaves, you've got a new competitor, lose a client, lose a big client, someone's going to let you down. You're going to hire someone and they might not go as expected. This gives you a general framework to prepare for those situations. The specific solutions obviously be unique to your agency, and glad to answer questions in Q&A about specific prep for the expected. But in the meantime, let's take a look at how to improvise the unexpected. Build a team, gather your best people together. Look for patterns. What are the patterns across what you're seeing? And consider precedents. What has happened when things similar to this have happened before? What worked? What didn't work? What do you need to modify? Break it down into smaller pieces. It can be overwhelming to solve a really big problem. It's a lot easier if you break it into smaller chunks. Consider, and this is something that I use frequently with agencies, what is your ideal outcome and what is your minimum acceptable outcome? For instance, you've got a client who's unhappy. If they're a small client, your minimum acceptable outcome is, if you lose them, that's fine. On the other hand, if they're a really big client, your minimum acceptable is you need to keep them as a client while you replace that revenue. That drives the right choice. If it's a tiny client that's difficult, you might go ahead and fire them. On the other hand, if it's a huge client, you might not push quite as hard. So your ideal outcome and your minimum acceptable outcome, keep those in mind. As Stephen Covey said, begin with the end in mind. And finally, get external perspective, right? Don't make decisions in a vacuum, in a bubble kind of thing. Get perspective from external advisors. Reach out to your fellow members of tribe. Odds are they've dealt with some form of similar situation before. And ultimately, if you keep these points in mind, you'll be able to improvise the unexpected, in part because you've prepared, you've built plans for the expected. And you do want to consider, before we move on to point 2 about warmth and competence, accept that there is no perfect solution, right? Often it's a case of having to pick the best of the worst options. And I found sometimes agency leaders get paralyzed by wanting the perfect solution. And they're like, well, these are all bad. I want the perfect solution. Often there isn't a perfect solution. And it's better to choose something, maybe the best or the worst, and move on. Not fun, but better to keep moving rather than getting stuck. If you have questions about this, about prepare for the expected and then you can improvise the unexpected, feel free to share in chat. And now let's move on to concept 2, warmth and competence, which helps, by the way, when you need to improvise. It gives you some framework. So warmth and competence is a simple yet powerful 2-part framework to help you upgrade your leadership and to help you get more from your next layer of leadership within your agency. And it's a concept I've used for the past decade. It comes from the book, the Warmth and Competence comes from the book, The Human Brand, by Chris Malone and Susan Fisk, a chief marketing officer, former CMO, and a psychology professor. Competence is about getting the job done. Warmth is about making people feel special. Competence is, did you get the job done? Warmth is about making people feel special. And you can use warmth and competence as a leader with your team, and you can also use warmth and competence with your clients. Did you get the job done, and did you make them feel special? And once you adopt warmth and competence, you can roll it out to your team as well. About a decade ago, I thought I was a pretty good manager, pretty good leader. I had been in different director roles at agencies. I thought, I had it down. And then I went to a leadership retreat. And in that leadership retreat, part of the prep process was to do 360-degree reviews, 360 reviews from various people I'd worked with. And I'm curious, by the way, if you want to share on chat, are you naturally better at warmth or better at competence? I found at the leadership retreat, based on those 360 reviews, I was much better at competence and not very good at warmth. And for other people, it was the opposite. And the idea there, the theme to the 360 reviews that I got from people I had worked with over the past decade, I was good at getting things done, but not at making it fun for everyone around me. Good at getting it done, not at making it fun. It was a sobering realization, especially as one of the other attendees pointed out, about leadership. He said, you can't be a leader if no one wants to follow you. If that resonates for you, you might be, maybe high on the competence side, low on the warmth side. You also might be the opposite. Maybe, fun is never a question, right? High warmth, everyone loves working with you. But maybe sometimes you struggle to get results. You struggle on the competence side, running your agency profitably. So feel free to share in chat. Do you lean more toward warmth or toward competence? Let's take a look about, what do we do now that we know that? Well, in my case, I adopted warmth and competence as a way to operate as a leader. Since then, I've launched my business, what's now Sakas Company, helped nearly 400 agencies worldwide. I led a volunteer team of nearly 100 volunteers to become number 2 nationally in the organization. You can change. You can shift. You can become high warmth and high competence. How? Well, Here's how. Start by understanding your natural strengths. Do you naturally lean toward warmth or toward competence? Most people tend to lean one way or the other. Some people have managed to master both, which is a great thing to aspire to. Ask your team to help. Call out when they see you skewing one way or the other, too far in one direction. And consider, how can you mechanically build out ways to fill those weaknesses in your work? For instance, if you lean toward warmth, but you struggle with competence, maybe you want to schedule a monthly sit down with your accounting and finance person to review how the profit and loss statement is going. Fun, everything's going smoothly, but you may not really want to talk about the numbers. You need to pay attention to the numbers. So having that monthly meeting helps make it happen. On the other hand, maybe you skew more toward competence. Maybe it's a situation where you build in reminders about sending thank you notes to your team, or thank you texts or IMs or what have you. So thinking about what you're good at, look for ways to build in solutions to get that done. Do you have any questions about warmth and competence? Glad to answer that in Q&A. But now let's take a look at the third concept for today, which is about making yourself increasingly optional in your agency. A few years ago, an agency owner in the US reached out and he had a problem. He was overworked and ready to make a change. I think this was one of his, you can imagine this is one of his team members dealing with the boss. It turns out that the agency owner was too mandatory from a day-to-day decision-making perspective. He was spending about 80% of his time on client billables, and meanwhile dealing with his team, and things weren't getting done, or they were getting done poorly, and he was like, I need to change this. What do we do? Well, over the next year and a half, we applied the 4 stages that I'm about to talk about to help make him increasingly optional in his work. He ended up reducing client work dramatically, down to 20% or less of his time. Some people choose to eliminate it completely. And ultimately, he's doing a lot better. Well, how do we get there? Well, let's consider the 4 stages and what I call the day-to-day involvement meter for you as an agency leader. Initially, you're mandatory, then you are necessary, then you are needed, and if you choose, you can pursue becoming optional. But let's take a look at what each of these are to help you identify which stage you're in now. Like, pay attention around which seems like where you are now and where do you want to be. Because once you know where you are now and where you want to be, there's some specific tips that I'll share to help you move up that stage or stages. And by the way, it is normal, you might be in more than one stage at once. For instance, maybe you are optional from a client delivery perspective, but you are necessary from a sales perspective. Like that, it's normal to be in more than one stage. All right, let's walk through these. Again, listen to which stage are you in now, and then which stage do you want to be in. When you are mandatory, you are just that. You are mandatory on a day-to-day basis. And, thinking about that, life is not fun when you are mandatory. Consider that, if it feels like you can't get away for a day, like going to lunch, something would blow up, you're probably mandatory. You're probably not getting paid what you're worth. You're probably pretty stressed out. That's mandatory. And also profits are likely not going smoothly. So what happens when you escape mandatory? Well, then you become necessary. Necessary is still not ideal, but you were less involved in all of the day-to-day decisions and day-to-day operations. Here are some signs that you might be necessary. Maybe you are no longer the primary client contact for everyone, but there are often problems with clients that you get pulled into to have to solve. Um, your team is making decisions without you, which is good, but often they are bad decisions, which means more drama and firefighting for you. As the owner of an agency in Portugal said, he said, Carl, I know there's always going to be some firefighting. I just wish that it wasn't a different part of the barn on fire every week. He was in the necessary stage. Profits are up. You might be able to take a couple days off, but the idea of taking a full week or two away, going on holiday seems very unlikely. So what happens when you move up from necessary stage 2? Well, stage 3 is needed. You are now needed, not necessary. Your team is making decisions without you. Generally, they're good decisions. You can go away for a week or two, uninterrupted, very exciting. You might not be able to do it immediately. The first time you take a couple weeks away, it may take a little bit of a ramp up process to get there. But it is possible when you are in stage 3, when you are needed. And as you're listening, think, does this sound like you? And ultimately, it is a continuum. Things keep getting better. For instance, a client who, I've helped him get from, necessary to needed. One of his plans was to take time off for paternity leave for his second child, and I helped him structure things. We did a ramp up, and he wasn't as fully unplugged as I was hoping I could help him be. And when we talked about it, he's like, no, this is amazing. When I had my first child, I didn't take any time off at all. So this is an improvement. Consider this is about progress, not perfection. You can always get better, but it's about improving things from where you've been before. And if you want, you can pursue stage 4, which is making yourself optional on a day-to-day basis. What does that look like? Well, you can get away. You are now optional in your agency. For instance, I helped a client get there last year. Helped make her increasingly optional. In fact, she took a 5-week honeymoon to Fiji and New Zealand and so on. This was pre-COVID. And when she got back, she realized, she basically worked herself out of the job. Like, she didn't need to be doing things anymore. She was kind of bored. And ultimately, she worked out an exit with her business partners and moved on. And of course, you don't have to do an exit. You can still be optional as a lifestyle agency owner. Now you just get to do the stuff you want to do instead of the stuff you have to do. So optional works whether you're leaning toward lifestyle or equity. And the key thing is that it's where you want to be optional. You can still do the things you want to do. So consider, out of the 4 stages, mandatory, necessary, needed, and optional, if you want to share in chat, where are you today and where do you want to go? And you might be in multiple stages. And Ian and Elaine, thinking about the way I've defined that, about the 4 stages, do you have a sense of where a lot of people are now, and also a sense of where they'd like to be?
I think, difficult to speak on behalf of other member agencies. I think at the moment, a lot of people are in the mandatory and necessary area because of what's
Yes.
happened.
Right.
And I would expect that people are all over their business to make sure the business gets through this. I think a lot of people would like to move to optional,
Yes.
and have a bit less. I can see Vanya nodding. The people kind of thinking, I'm still involved, but I'm not involved at the pace I normally work at. So I think
Yes.
people would certainly like to move to that. I think I'm gonna keep the questions at the end, but I'm going to ask you a question
Sure,
now.
sure.
What are the causes of people remaining in mandatory for a long time? What causes that? Is that a power thing? Is it a lack of trust thing? What is it that not forces, but keeps people in the mandatory involvement?
A few things. So if an agency is in the first year or two of doing business, it is normal for the owner or the owners to be mandatory, right? Because you don't have a large team of people to do things. So if you're in the first year or two, that's normal. But if it's beyond that, there can be a few causes. One that I'll hear from owners is things like, I'm mandatory because I don't trust my team to get it done. They can't do it as well as I do. And that's the thing. If you are the owner or leader at an agency, you're probably better at a lot of things compared to your team. But ideally, you're focusing on the, what I call $1,000 an hour or £1,000 or €1,000 or whatever unit of currency an hour activities rather than the things that you could outsource to others. So if you're mandatory because your team can't do it, I think ultimately you need to figure out how can you get people you trust to do it. Sometimes though, people are mandatory, when they have people who could help, but it's maybe the owner or the leader's own fault because they don't trust people when perhaps they could or should. And to some extent that may be if it's about trying to maintain control when you've got trustworthy people. Some of that may be a talk to your therapist situation. This year I'm a fan of therapy. This year marks on and off 20 years of going to therapy for me. We all need someone to talk to. And if you've got a situation where in theory you should be able to trust your team, they have experience, they've generally made good decisions. If you still feel mandatory, that may be partly you. I did an exercise with an owner several years ago where he was like, my team keeps asking me what to do. Like, I don't want them to keep interrupting me. And we did some work digging into, why they were interrupting and who's interrupting, what the patterns were. And I did some follow-up conversations with his team. And I found something interesting, which is he had trained them to make him mandatory. How so? Well, as I spoke with his team, it turned out that whenever they made decisions on their own, he would often overrule them. They'd make a decision, they'd tell clients something, and then the owner would come in and be like, no, we're not going to do that. I want you to, change this. So then the employee had to go back to the client and say, I know I said we'd do this. Actually, now we're going to do this. And made employees look bad. And ultimately, they finally realized, well, I'm not going to make a decision unless I talk to the boss first. Good news, if you're in this situation, you want to change that, what I'll share next will help you escape that situation. But Ian, does that help answer that question?
Yeah, no, I think so. I think I think for some people, if they're faced with the mandatory for year after year, something has to give. Either they leave
Yes.
or the leader has to leave,
Yes.
because having that kind of power thing or a lack of trust, I think, is particularly demotivating for people. Uh,
Yes.
People want to kind of climb up the ladder and do better for themselves. So I
Exactly.
think, the mandatory is, I understand it for new starts. I understand it during a pandemic, a
For
crisis,
sure. For
absolutely.
sure.
But on an ongoing basis, year after year, I'm not sure that's a good thing. And it's interesting, I see comments from Daniel and from Javier that, people are a kind of either across the spectrum, or they're in different parts depending on what the particular job is that they're involved with, which I
Right.
think probably applies to quite a few people as well.
Absolutely. Well, let's look at how people can make changes to solve things. And then I've got a bonus for people. We'll answer questions. And then I've got a challenge for everyone to help you apply this at your agency. So consider how your quality of life improves every time you move up, right? Mandatory, necessary, needed, and optional. What can you do to move up each stage from 1, 2, 3, 4? There are a lot of things you need to do, but I've identified in my work a specific thing you can do to improve at each step. If you're currently mandatory and you want to become necessary, it's a concept I call swim lanes. That's ultimately about getting clear on who's in charge of what and who's not in charge of what. For instance, that might mean one person in your agency is in charge of sales and others may be supporting them, but if that's in that person's swim lanes, it's their decision. Maybe your business operations, someone else is handling operations. Maybe someone else is handling client delivery. And, depending on the size of your agency, you may be wearing multiple hats. The key thing about swim lanes is that if people are clear on what is in their swim lane and what's not, you're not going to get pulled in to make decisions about every single thing. And this is an iterative process. You may not define all of your swim lanes initially. Some of them will shift over time. But the more clear you can get on who's in charge of what and who's not in charge of what, the sooner you can move from mandatory up to necessary, from stage 1 to stage 2. Now, what do you do if you're necessary already and you want to become needed but not necessary? In that case, it's a concept I call values, goals, and resources, or VGR. Values, goals, and resources is a decision-making shortcut. Once you've defined what people's swim lanes are, when they understand the values, goals, and resources involved to make better decisions, they'll make better decisions without having to ask you every single time. How does that work? Well, there are unique values, goals, and resources within your agency. There are unique values, goals, resources for you as a leader. And there are also, when it comes to client relationships, each client has their own values, goals, and resources. If people understand what the VGR they can make better decisions. So for instance, someone is struggling to decide what to do. Normally, maybe they'd ask you what to do. If they know their swim lanes, and they know the values, goals, and resources, they can probably make a decision without asking you. Or if they do, they can come to you with most of the decision already made. They could say, I need to figure out such and such. According to values, goals, and resources, I've narrowed it down to 2 options. I'm leaning toward, option A. Does that make sense? Now you as the boss are just making a yes/no decision rather than having to make the decision for the employee. But this doesn't work unless they know their values, goals, and resources. What if you're currently needed and you want to move to optional? And glad to answer your questions on this in Q&A. If you're currently needed and you want to become optional, that's about hiring and coaching. Hiring the right people and coaching them to help them improve. If you've ever thought to yourself, gosh, I tell the team something and they don't just do it. Why aren't they doing it? Well, keep in mind that repetition is important. I worked with a client in New York who mentioned that, he had a particular problem where people weren't logging things at the end of the day and getting files uploaded to their file system. And I was like, okay, how have you discussed this with them? And he's like, well, I told them at the all hands meeting, the monthly meeting, a few months ago, and people aren't doing it. Oh, well, if you've mentioned it once amidst several other topics, they're probably not going to just magically start doing it. I said, what if you mentioned it every month, to get this done? It's like, okay, that makes sense. I said, also, how do you, when you've mentioned it individually to people, how have you framed it? It's like, well, I don't know, I tell them it's something they should do. In his case, I dug in as his coach. He often had a very irreverent approach to things. And so people thought he was joking, right? That he mentioned it once or he'd mention it occasionally. They didn't think he was serious about it. And we shifted that, and you know what? He was able to change those behaviors. So even when you have great people, hiring, what I call new rope rather than wet twine, you still have to coach them on improving. So let's do a recap on the 3 concepts, share that free resource, and answer your questions. If you want to prepare for the future, your ideal future, whether that's in 2021 or beyond, take time first, prepare for the expected, so you have space, you have room to improvise the unexpected. Practice warmth and competence. Remember, warmth is making people feel special, competence is getting the job done. You can use warmth and competence as a leader and with your clients, and your team can apply it too. And then finally, look for ways to reduce your day-to-day involvement, moving through the 4 stages toward optional and becoming optional if you so choose. So go ahead and share questions. If you haven't shared questions yet, go ahead and share those on chat. But I have a free resource for you. As an agency project manager, I was about to share some constructive feedback with one of our team members, Bob. Bob was one of our developers. He wasn't very productive, and I hate to admit it, I was getting ready to unload on him. I was really unhappy with his performance. During the drive to work that day, I happened to be listening to the audio version of the Dale Carnegie classic, How to Win Friends and Influence People. And that day, the segment I listened to on the drive to work as I was getting ready to go yell at Bob was the segment on don't criticize, condemn, or complain. Dale Carnegie made the point that if you criticize, condemn, or complain, people shut down. You know, if you criticize or condemn them, they're not going to listen. You're not going to get the results you want. And I was like, ooh, I was about to do that. This was before I had gone to the leadership retreat and learned about warmth and competence. I was going to be all about competence and no warmth. And I realized that I needed to regroup. I regrouped and I asked the developer why he was running into challenges. Turns out he didn't have that much experience. Our senior developer hadn't shared how to solve a particular problem. The junior employee didn't know how to solve it himself or where to go to look to solve it. I connected them and ultimately Bob got better. It turned out getting that timely tip that morning made the difference in retaining Bob rather than him wanting to quit or him continuing to perform poorly. Why do I mention that? The idea of timely tips. Well, I have some timely tips for you. Several years ago, I wrote the book Made to Lead. It's a pocket guide to managing marketing and creative teams. And it's a quick read. It's, you know, it's short. Most people say they read it in, 20 to 30 minutes. But there's a power in timely tips, like I discovered with How to Win Friends and Influence People. And if you go to bit.ly/trybonus, you can get all of the tips from Made to Lead on a daily basis, Monday through Friday for a month. Those may be just the timely tips you need to improve as a leader at your agency. And, check them out. I look forward to, hearing how you apply them. Stick around for the very end. I've got a challenge for you about applying the advice. But for now, Ian, I'm curious what questions have come in, or what questions are you thinking of?
Yep, there's a few questions coming in. One of the questions is about warmth and competence. And we hear and see and read a lot about how the world has changed, and empathy and understanding are very important.
Yes.
We see that it is possible to improve competence, but how do you build up the more emotional side of warmth, if that's maybe not your natural thing? I'm not suggesting this is any of the tribe agencies. I'm just interested.
Sure. Yeah.
How we do that.
Something from my own experience as someone who naturally tends toward high competence but lower on warmth. First is just being aware of it. So whenever I'm getting ready to send an email to a client, especially if it's a potentially tense email, I think about, does this have enough warmth, right? Just even knowing that it might be a potentially difficult situation. For instance, earlier today, I was sharing feedback with a client about his annual plan for the coming year. And one of the things I realized was that he's unloading a lot on his leadership team. And everything overall makes sense. The problem is the way the plan is framed, it's a bit of a Hunger Games situation or Lord of the Flies, where if people read it the wrong way, if they get the plan the wrong way, they're going to feel like they're competing with the other directors at the agency. And so the challenge for me as his coach was, naturally I'd be like, don't share this with people. This is a terrible idea. This is a terrible plan. This is really, really bad. Now, obviously that's not constructive to share, right? I know the negative impact it's going to have on his team and on morale and how that's contrary to his goals that he shared. But it's not constructive for me to share the feedback like that. And so instead, I reached out by asking via text, what is the status on his sharing that with the team? He hasn't shared it yet. He's going to share it in early December. Okay, that's good. If he had already shared it, my advice would be a bit different than if he hasn't shared it yet. I said, okay, we have a call coming up tomorrow. I have some concerns, and sort of a softer approach. So that's an example. Does that help? Just being aware and then taking steps.
Yeah, no, I understand that. I think one of the other things that's come through in a message is that you talked about, preparing for the future, preparing for the expected and the unexpected. I think something that, many businesses are facing is needing less people.
Right.
Clients have stopped spending, clients have gone bust, whatever it might be. I'm just wondering about the kind of management and how that is discussed amongst a leadership team, because obviously there's people that you're close to and that have helped, build your business. I'm just wondering about any tips for managing what are very clearly very difficult conversations about people.
Yeah. Thinking about, and for people listening, either, you are the boss, or, maybe you're reporting to the owner. If you're not an owner yourself, you're among the top people. Think about when you've been an employee before in the past, when you didn't have as much power in your business as you do now. I've always found it's helped to have bosses who are transparent, even if it's sharing bad news, rather than wondering what's going on. Because the reality is your employees know what's going on, right? Whether you tell them or not, they can tell how you're being about things. They can tell if you're stressed out or if you're in a good mood or what have you. And they're paying close attention to that. What you say as the boss makes a high impact within your agency, within your business. Because, if you think about it, you may have other business activities, you may have other sources of income. Odds are, for your employees, this is their primary source of income. They're very attuned to how things are going, and they have a strong interest in things going smoothly. So you've got smart people working for you. I would lean toward being more transparent, all things considered, rather than trying to hide things, even if it's bad news. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean getting into everyone's dirty laundry, but in general, I lean toward more transparency than not. But keep in mind, once you start being transparent, you will have to keep it up. I've had some agencies say, we want to do open book accounting. And I'm like, there is value to doing that, but keep in mind, you will have to keep sharing the results, even if things go poorly, because then people will be like, well, why aren't we getting the results anymore? What's going on?
Okay. And this is a great question. It's come in privately, so I won't say who it's sent by, but I
Sure,
think a
sure.
lot of people can relate to this. This person is saying that much of their time and the agency chief exec's time is all about networking, selling, and being part of the conversation when someone needs to hear an insight, etc. The question they have is that kind of networking, getting to know people and selling and being the person that people come and talk to sounds like a hard skill to coach others in. Do you have
Yeah.
any advice about coaching these particular types of skills?
When I look at clients who have top performing salespeople, the top performing salespeople often were people who were previously account managers or previously subject matter experts within the agency. So, like, they knew the work the agency did quite well, and they wanted to move into sales. So the idea there is they had the subject matter knowledge and they had an interest in doing sales and in connecting with prospective clients. Sometimes they also had an interest, typically, in making more money, which you can do as a salesperson at an agency. So that combo of subject matter, content experience, as well as an interest in selling and a desire to make more money, that tends to be a winning combination. On the other hand, if you have an employee who has no interest in doing sales, don't make them start doing sales. That's not going to go smoothly. So, in general, the goal is someone who either has that already and has an interest in developing it. If someone doesn't have an interest in developing it, I don't see that going smoothly because they're not going to be enthusiastic. You need three things: desire, competence, and capacity. If they don't have desire, even if they have competence and capacity, they're not going to be excited about it. Does that help on that?
Yeah, I think that's interesting because it is about it is more about softer skills or more emotional skills rather than rational. It's how you can coach and help people with that. So hopefully that is of help.
Yeah,
Um, Another question I have is, which I think is an interesting question,
yeah.
um, is how many people can you actually lead directly? And at what stage do you need to build in a kind of middle management to take on other responsibilities?
There's a concept
Especially at
called
COVID times, because it's difficult, we're not all in the same place. So I think, it's complicated and made more difficult in the current climate.
one of the things that I note in the Made to Lead book is that it's easy to be a bad boss. It's really hard to be a good boss. It is harder to manage a remote team than it is to manage an in-person team, right? In person, if you need to convey something, you just yell across the room or walk down the hall, right? If it's remote, it's a bit harder. So certainly there are some challenges to that. I would start by looking at what are your strengths and where do you struggle. Did you want to elaborate a bit more on the question there to make sure I
No,
get
it's just really about, you read lots of leadership articles and people have
Mhm.
6, 8, 10, 12 direct reports, and then they've got 10, 20 people reporting into them. What
Yes.
are the kind of sensible sides to manage in terms of the leader and his or her direct reports, and then when you have to have a real middle layer of management?
So the number of people reporting to you, the technical term for that is span of control. And usually the ideal span of control is 5 to 7 people at most. That is no more than 5 to 7 people reporting to you directly. They can have people reporting to them, of course, but ideally no more than 5 to 7 reporting per manager. If you've got someone who's a brand new manager, they probably can't handle 7. On the other hand, if you've been handling, management for a long time and you like it, you could probably, handle that many or more. So if you're at the point where you're managing 5 to 7 now and you plan to grow, you probably need to get ready to add a new layer where some of the people report to a middle manager layer. Um, Keep in mind, though, that if someone suddenly goes from reporting to you and they get all the face time with you as the boss, and then now they're reporting to someone new, not everyone's going to like that. So you're going to have to do some change management on that as well. But I'd recommend no more than 5 to 7 direct reports. And for some of the agencies I work with, the owner wants one direct report. They want say they're the CEO, they want a COO or a managing director running everything and reporting to them. There are pros and cons to that approach. Things tend not to go quite as smoothly as you think. So if you're like, I want to go from managing a lot of people down to managing no one, I mean, if you're running an independent agency, you're going to have at least one direct report, and you're probably going to have more. So some of it'll be specific to your situation, but I'd recommend targeting 5 to 7.
Okay. I have two more questions.
Sure.
Um, this is not so much about leadership, but I just think it's interesting for everybody. You talked about client concentration,
Yes.
and you read different statistics in different mags and online about once you have a client that is more than a certain percentage of your business, It
Yes.
starts to become, it's great because they're paying for a lot of stuff, but if they
Right.
go, it's a
Right.
crisis. Did you say 20% was a kind of like a kind of threshold?
That is my cutoff, and some people may choose to make that higher, may make it lower. Some of that depends on the strength of your sales pipeline, but I have found that if you have a client who's more than 20% of your agency's business, you tend to start making risky decisions, right? You're like, well, they're really bad with our team, but we need the money, so we're going to keep them. You'll probably keep the client, and you'll lose your best employees.
Yeah.
Or you've got a situation where you need to push back, you feel like you can't, that kind of thing. So I'd recommend 20%. If your number is higher, the goal is to figure out ways to build your pipeline and do deliverable work for other clients to get that percentage down to or below 20. It's
Yeah.
hard, but
Yeah.
it starts by choosing to make it a priority.
Okay. And it's truly international today. From Turab in India, how do you plan for succession in these very uncertain times?
So different people have different approaches to succession. Some, their goal, I mentioned the idea of lifestyle versus equity agency. If you're on the equity side, it's a continuum. You may want to do a full exit where you're out completely after an earnout, a couple years maybe, and you're gone. For others, the goal is to bring in, employees as shareholders, and maybe you're still involved, but less so. And there are different pieces there. My key thing when it comes to succession planning is that things are a lot easier if you have an existing team member who can step in to eventually take your role. It's a lot harder if you need to hire externally. Why? Well, not only are you ramping them up at their job for an external hire, which would be true for an internal promotion as well, you're trying to figure out, do you trust them? You're trying to understand a sense of their character. If you've got someone who's worked for you for 5 years and you want to promote them to become the managing director, eventually, some sort of leadership role, eventually become CEO or something like that, so that you can step back. If you've worked with them for 5 years, you probably have a pretty good idea of their character, right? If they've had opportunities to make bad choices, you would have seen it by now. In contrast, if you hire externally someone you've never worked with before, you're putting control of your agency into the hands of someone that, you don't know. It's a risky situation. You always want to have a new hire ramp up plan. That's what I call it, which is, what do you have in month 1, 2, 3, and so on. You could think of it as a 30, 60, 90-day plan. But if you're moving someone into a succession role to succeed you as the leader of the agency, that needs to be even more robust. For instance, I'm helping a client do this right now where they've done a promotion from within. The person will be in a C-level role for a year. If he succeeds in that and hits certain targets, then will become chief operating officer. If he succeeds in that for a couple more years, eventually can become CEO. But the key thing is they're not just immediately turning things over to this team member. It would take a lot longer if it was an external hire. Does that help?
Yeah, that is good. Now, that that is us. Did you have a challenge you were going to finish with before
I
we?
I do, I do. So for everyone listening live, or if you're watching the recording, I have a challenge for you. Coming from an agency operations background, my parents were both career Army officers. The idea of getting results has always been, very important. So you could take the things you learned and do nothing, but I wouldn't recommend that. So here's my challenge for you. Take the things we've discussed today, and I encourage you to take at least one of these and start applying it in the next week. Maybe it's committing to warmth and competence. Maybe it's defining swim lanes. Maybe it's thinking about the values, goals, and resources that your team should keep in mind. Maybe you're going to create a list of expected challenges so that you're ready, so that you have space to improvise the unexpected. Whatever it might be, I encourage you to take at least one of those and start using it in the next week. And then I'd love to hear how it goes. I have my email address, karl@sakascompany.com. I'd love to hear the results you get. Ultimately, apply this advice to make things easier for a brighter future in 2021 and beyond. Thanks, and good luck out there.
Karl, thank you. Very good. Thank you for joining us and sharing
Absolutely.
your words of wisdom.
Thank
Uh,
you.
Also, just a big thank you to everyone from the tribe. I see many familiar faces there today. It's great to see you, and thank you for your support during this webinar series. As always, we'll be sharing the recording on Basecamp, so you can have another listen to some of the key insights from Karl. This is the last in our series. If you have some suggestions or you have some speakers for next year, we're having a think about all the different things we can do. Elaine and I would be delighted to have any ideas and suggestions. But in the meantime, thank you, Karl. Thank you, everybody. Take care and stay safe. Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.